Hey everybody. Okay, so time for part two of day two of psychedelics. So I'm going to devote this little segment to MDMA or ecstasy. So I'll just focus on that. Very interesting and popular recreational drug that has psychedelic and empathogenic effects. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how that works in the brain and at a cellular molecular level. Okay, MDMA, ecstasy or Molly. It's okay. Let's see if I can pronounce this. 3,4-methyl and methamphetamine. Okay, so a lot. That's a mouthful. MDMA. So yes, as you can see from looking at the word, it has methamphetamine in it. And so very well, it does actually have a structure very similar to methamphetamine, and that might account for some of the stimulant effects people report after they take MDMA. So this chemical, like many of the chemicals and currently illicit chemicals in the world, were developed by some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies on the planet. And this is no exception. This was developed by Merck Pharmaceuticals way back in 1914, around the time of World War I. So it's been around a long time. It wasn't really used recreationally until the 50s or so, and actually really much later than that. It was used, though, the CIA and MK Ultra, which we talked about in the classic psychedelics lecture. It was used by the CIA and MK Ultra as a potential brainwashing or truth serum drug in the 50s, in those somewhat terrifying studies where they would go ahead and unwittingly give people drugs like MDMA and then see if you could make people tell you their deepest and darkest secrets. All right, so MDMA, it's been around a long time. It's structurally similar, like I said, to methamphetamine, but also somewhat similar to mescaline too. So it's almost like a hybrid of the two drugs. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. All right, how does taking MDMA make you feel? It's enactogenic, and so in low doses, it's definitely very stimulating. So it has that stimulant effect, like a low level of taking maybe a low amount of methamphetamine. And it's empathogenic in that if you're in a social situation, you can feel more empathy, more connection, more trust with those around you. So taking higher doses can definitely lead to classic hallucinations, similar to some of the hallucinations you see in like psilocybin and things like that. You need higher doses for that. We'll talk about this too, is that you've got to be careful for those who are taking higher doses, because it's also associated with dangers like hyperthermia, where you get too hot, you can get dehydrated and overheat, and even at extreme cases, even die if you really overheat. So if you're around someone who's taking a lot of MDMA, check up on them, make sure they're not literally overheating or dehydrating. It can be very dangerous. All right. Now, very early on in psychedelic research, given the clear observation that MDMA can enhance trust between people, people started thinking, had the bright idea, which is a good idea, that it might actually enhance the trust with your psychotherapist. And if you have more trust or connection with the person who's trying to help you through your emotional trauma, then the psychotherapy itself may be improved. And so that was actually researched extensively in the 70s, and it started in the early 80s, into the early 80s. But then there were some people abusing the drugs, and then it got put into Schedule 1 in 1985. So a little later than the other drugs that we talked about, like LSD, which were put in Schedule 1 much earlier, like decades earlier. But in 1985 it was put on Schedule 1. So research in the use of MDMA as a therapeutic pretty much stopped then. But that didn't mean that the use or illegal use stopped. As many of you probably have heard, it's a very popular club drug. It has been popular throughout the late 80s, 90s, 2000s. It's a rave drug. And so there's definitely, though, a renewed interest in the past 5 or so years, in even more, I guess it's almost 10 years now, where there's been actually a renewed interest, scientific interest, in using this drug, MDMA, to treat disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And so it's being reevaluated. There's some ongoing studies and some earlier pilot studies, which I'll talk about in a moment, that suggests that MDMA may be very effective when combined with psychotherapy to treat some of these disorders like PTSD or maybe other anxiety-related disorders. All right, so what are the short and long-term effects of MDMA? So, as I mentioned, the immediate effect of MDMA may be feelings of empathy or euphoria, maybe some stimulation like you might get with a stimulant drug. So it kind of acts like some of the dopaminergic drugs we talked about, but also the empathy is something new. Your typical dopaminergic drugs do not produce feelings of empathy. But the stimulation probably does, and the euphoria might connect with the dopaminergic drugs that sometimes you can get with high amounts of those, like cocaine. But the empathy is something relatively unique to MDMA. All right, as I mentioned before, abusing or using too much of this drug without drinking enough water or keeping cool can really radically increase core body temperatures. So making hyperthermia and dehydration a risk. And so you might have noticed at some raves or places where you might see people popping these MDMA pills, some very kind people have often set up water supply stations where they have free water bottles so that people who can or maybe are taking too much or not keeping control of their body temperatures can take some water to cool down and rehydrate. All right, there's another danger with at least the pills that might be available at, let's say, a rave or something like that, is that, like any illicit drug, you can't always be sure what's in it, and so they often cut the MDMA pills with other drugs as well. So it's just a mixture of things. Just to be careful with any illicit drug. Probably the most serious was something like heroin, which is not a psychedelic, but which cutting is common with fentanyl, and fentanyl, since it's 80 to 100 times more potent than heroin, you can kill you. So, but ecstasy, those pills also have a history where some people have mixed them with other drugs. All right, so that's the short term. I don't know, get like hours. Then you have the intermediate term, like days following the use of it. So as we'll talk about in a second, MDMA really activates and hyperactivates the release of serotonin in your neurons. And to the extent that the neurons have a hard time replacing that lost serotonin. And so because it's being depleted, you actually might have a low level of serotonin in your brain for a day or two. And that is thought to lead to the situation that's called Suicide Tuesday. So if you take your ecstasy on Monday, you're feeling great, but look out for Tuesday because you can feel like complete crap and depressed, and that could very well be because you kind of blew out all of your serotonin stores on Monday. All right, so that's a potential. Then it rebounds back. So if you don't abuse it and using too much of it, you'll recover from Suicide Tuesday, and you'll be okay. All right. Long term. So let's say those who repeatedly use MDMA at fairly high doses. Well, there's definitely studies in animals, including primates, that high use of MDMA or high concentrations of MDMA in the brain destroys those serotonin neurons and the axons. And so we don't know what the lethal dose is. So it's still clear that it can be toxic to these cells, but how much is toxic needs to still be figured out. There's also some evidence, again in animal studies, that it might mess up those micro little blood vessels in your brain, and that could ultimately affect cognition. And for the real long-term users, there's some evidence that the hippocampus gets smaller and that memory problems are there. Yet, even though I said previously that this is potentially being used as a treatment for PTSD, Well, I think we're still working out the doses, but the idea is that the lower doses should hopefully not produce any of these cytotoxic, neurotoxic effects. But unfortunately, we don't have all the answers yet. We don't, again, know how much of this is required to lead to neural damage and how much is safe. All right. Mechanisms. Okay. This will be a nice review of synaptic mechanisms of communication because really MDMA acts on a bunch of systems, and it's an interesting review of things we talked about in the first couple weeks of the class. All right, so it's very clever. So it acts, first of all, like I mentioned before, on the dopamine system itself. It has a shape very similar to some of these dopamine drugs, and dopamine itself too, methamphetamine. And so it can stimulate the brain by acting very on dopamine receptors. All right, so that's where you get the stimulant effect. But the empathogenic effect is thought to go not to the dopamine system, it's all in the serotonin system, the 5-HT, 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is serotonin system. Okay, so it does this in a couple ways. I'm going to walk through some of these steps that are illustrated in this multi-step diagram over there on the right. All right, so one of the first things it does is it prevents the repackaging of the serotonin into the vesicles. And so what that means is you get more of the serotonin in the presynaptic area, which we call the cytosol. This is the kind of the fluids and the goo that's in the cell, or in this case in the synapse, but not inside the vesicle or mitochondria. It's that goo that's just in the synapse, but not inside an organelle. All right, so you get more of the serotonin there. Now, if that was the only thing that happened, then the serotonin would be broken down and there'd be no more release. But that's not the only thing that happens. The MDMA also blocks or actually reverses the pump, the serotonin transporter that goes ahead and is supposed to suck up the extra serotonin from the synapse. Instead, it reverses the direction of that pump. And so all of the extra serotonin that's been pulled out of the vesicles now gets dumped into the synapse. And so it's a way for essentially blowing all the serotonin out of that presynaptic terminal and dumping it into that synaptic space. And it essentially boils down to causing a massive release of serotonin from the presynaptic terminal. All right, so that's the main way by which you get MDMA to produce huge amounts of serotonin. Now, as I mentioned before, you have this thing called called Suicide Tuesdays, where you get somewhat of a depressed state maybe a day or so after taking MDMA. Well, that is usually associated with low serotonin. Well, here's the issue. Now that you've gone ahead and caused all of the serotonin stored up in those vesicles to be dumped out, or to be floating around inside the cytosol, then you have the little Pac-Man, the little monoamine oxidase, which is MAO, and it's there breaking down the serotonin. So any serotonin that's left over and is outside in that cytosol is now also getting chopped up. There's really nothing left. After it's been both released from the vesicles, released from the synapse, and broken down by the MAO, you have very low serotonin levels. Of course, this goes up over time, and so it replenishes itself and things go back to normal, but it takes a while. And so that may contribute to the ecstasy-associated depression that can follow, let's say, a day after use. Okay, now let's go back to the empathy effect of MDMA. One idea as to why, serotonin we think is involved in feelings of feeling good and maybe the psychedelic effects of MDMA. But empathy, again, is something unique to MDMA. And for reasons we don't understand, MDMA does increase blood levels of oxytocin and prolactin from your pituitary gland. We've talked a lot about the pituitary and its connection with the hypothalamus. So the pituitary is this master kind of hormone distributor in the brain, and so it's dumping these hormones into the bloodstream, which ultimately often make their way back into the brain. In this case, oxytocin for sure makes its way back into the brain, and oxytocin has really gotten a lot of notoriety, and you might have heard of it before. People would maybe call it the love drug, which is maybe an oversimplification, but it's really forming a connection drug. Like your people within your group, you care about them more, you'll protect them more, and so it's let's see, call it maybe a friend or local affiliation kind of drug. I guess it's not a very good word, but oxytocin. You can think of it the love drug. Okay, make it simple. But it's essentially a drug that, again, makes you more connected with others. It's a big hormone. It enters the blood. It goes back into the brain. It affects areas like the amygdala and other areas involved in emotion. And that increase in oxytocin can lead to empathic and trusting behaviors. And that may explain why MDMA makes you feel more trust towards others and increase your generosity. All right. And that's why the CIA thought it was a great idea to maybe use that as a truth serum. Also, if you happen to know that you go to a yard sale and you know the owner of the house just happened to take some MDMA, you might get some good deals. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. All right, MDMA as a therapy. Okay, can it be used to treat diseases? I mentioned before that maybe it's a potential treatment for the debilitating, absolutely debilitating condition of post-traumatic stress disorder, affecting anyone, soldiers, people experiencing traumatic events such as rape or any type of abuse. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is basically a horrible disorder, but it's often treated with psychotherapy. And now in a pilot study, this was actually done in 2010, but now they're more recent ongoing studies. But in this 2010 study, they looked at combining MDMA with psychotherapy for people with PTSD to see if it helped. And from that pilot study, it was pretty encouraging. And they found that participants with, in this case, really severe treatment-resistant PTSD, that those 85% of those who took the MDMA with the psychotherapy really had a long-lasting 3.5-year improvement in their condition. And that was only the case for 15% of the people in the placebo group. All right, so that was incredibly encouraging. Again, it was a pilot study. So this older study has to be taken with some skepticism, because in general, pilot studies mean that there weren't many people in the study, or there weren't enough controls, or they didn't do a double blind, something like that. But encouraging. And then more recently, they're currently ongoing, but not completed yet, studies on using MDMA. This is a snippet from the MAPS website, which is a great website to look at if you're looking for the real legit research being done on using psychotropic drugs, therapeutical psychedelic drugs for therapy. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Definitely check out the site. But they have listed some of the ongoing studies, and phase 3 is a pretty late stage of a study. And so in this case, this trial to see if this drug actually helps, using MDMA to assist, not alone, but to assist with psychotherapy in PTSD. It's expected to be completed in 1 year. Hopefully it can be now, given the coronavirus situation. Almost all human research is being put on hold because you have a very hard time doing these studies, and if you have to limit human contact. But yeah, I know a lot of colleagues in the psych department who have pretty much had to shut their lab for now because they can't do studies with human subjects. So it's a pretty trying time for human studies right now, and animal studies even, because nobody can come to the lab. So as an aside. All right. The phase 3 trials are expected to be completed, if all goes as planned, in 2021. And that if that works and it's successful, then the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which approves all drugs, could approve this treatment in 2022. So it could just be a couple years in theory that we may have a new treatment for PTSD. Okay, the cat tells me to end this segment, so on to the next.